Welcome, it is Mitch. I'm on YouTube. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel as we try to build this thing up. Wanted to hop on today. Would have had a video anyways, and was kind of brainstorming a couple of topics, and then one kind of presented itself naturally. And it revolves around George Pickens at first, and then there's Packers layers to it. George Pickens, receiver for the Pittsburgh Steelers, traded to the Dallas Cowboys on Wednesday. For a third-round pick, essentially. There was like a late swap where, what was it? Pittsburgh gets like a 2027 fifth, and they give up a 2026 sixth. In essence, Pickens was traded for a third-round pick. And I think most would regard Pickens as what? Like a pretty high-end number 2 wide receiver. Like, let me look at his career averages. So, across 3 years, Pickens is averaging 62 receptions for 1,006 yards and 4 touchdowns a season. Those are his averages over a 3-year span. I would say he's like a good high-end number 2 wide receiver. He's a deep threat. He's a little unpredictable, I guess. He isn't shy about speaking his mind when he's not happy with how things are going. So Dallas is taking on George Pickens, the player, but also George Pickens, the personality. And there's a lot to that, which might rub some teams the wrong way, might have other teams shy away if Pittsburgh was shopping around George Pickens. But in essence, the nuts and bolts of this is that Pickens goes for a third-round pick. And one name that has been rumored about for Green Bay this offseason is Romeo Doubs, and whether or not the Packers would entertain a trade of Romeo Doubs. And there's a lot of tentacles to this. The premise for me is built around, after seeing the George Pickens trade on Wednesday, to me it makes no sense to trade Romeo Doubs. It doesn't. Keep him for 2025, whether you get an extension done or not this offseason, whether or not you're motivated, if you're Brian Gutekunst and company, to get an extension done or not with Romeo Doubs. Keep him for 2025. To me, it far outweighs the positives of trading, specifically, not a player to the caliber of Romeo Doubs, not one of your wide receivers, but Romeo Doubs specifically. First off, I mean, if we go back to January when the Packers, and I'm hashing open an old wound for some of you, but if we go back to January when Goody spoke to reporters shortly after the season ended, it was like a couple days after Green Bay had lost to Philadelphia on Wild Card Weekend. And Goody's very calculated with what he says in these pressers. We hear from him a few times a year on an extended version, really less than that, only a couple of times a year. And one of them is the sort of end-of-the-season presser, putting a bow on the show. And if you go back to January, Goody, again, who's very, very cautious with what he says, just calculated, I would say. He had a quote that raised some eyebrows in a good way, I think in a good way, and it just kind of steered away from how he typically conducts himself in these press conferences. And this is back in January. And the direct quote from Goody is, he's talking about the Packers. He says, "These opportunities don't come every year. The life of a player in the National Football League is not very long. We've got a bunch of good guys in that locker room. We've got a bunch of talented guys in that locker room. Fine." Then he says, "I think it's time we started competing for championships, right? I think they're ready." And to an outsider, someone who isn't a Packers fan, doesn't follow things on a daily basis or even a semi-daily basis, hearing your general manager say, "Hey, it's time we start competing for championships," right? Like, to an outsider, you might be like, okay, what? Like, who cares that the GM says that? It's because it's Goody. It's because it's straight away from something he would normally say. It was very direct. It was very blunt. To me, that word urgency that's been thrown around this offseason, and Goody has used it himself, it raised that bar. Like, it raised the urgency for the Packers. Your first 2 years, you go to the playoffs with Jordan Love, his first 2 years as a starter. And I would argue the first year was probably better than the second. There was some regression in the passing game. I'm not talking about specifically Jordan Love, but if we were expecting a leap from the Packers with Jordan Love as the year 2 starter, we really didn't see it from the team. I thought the defense was way better under Jeff Hafley. There's things to nitpick across the board, things to praise across the board. But Goody's saying, we're ready to compete for championships now, right? Like, yeah. And if that's the tone you're setting, how does a Romeo Doubs trade accomplish that? Think about it. A Romeo Doubs trade is a move you make with an eye towards the future, because you would be trading a player who's good now, who's ready now, who's a reliable target for Jordan Love now, for a future pick, for future draft compensation. So if your goal that you're trying to accomplish is, again, these are Goody's words, I think it's time we started competing for championships, right? I think they're ready. And so if it's, hey, right now we're ready to compete for championships, we're trying to take that next step, how does trading Romeo Doubs for a 2026 pick accomplish that? Secondarily, another layer to this that to me makes it just doesn't make sense to me. If Pickens goes for a third, and I think most would regard Pickens as a high-end number 2 receiver, Doubs doesn't get you a third. His numbers aren't as gaudy as Pickens, especially when you look at yardage totals. Availability, and it's not Dobbs' fault. He had 2 concussions last year, right? And he was suspended another game for conduct detrimental to the team after skipping 2 practices. He was upset with his role, so on and so forth. If Pickens gets you a third-round pick, realistically, Green Bay can expect what? A fifth, I would say? Like a fifth-rounder. You know, the Pickens trade kind of says what the market is saying. It speaks for the market. And so if Pickens is going for a third-rounder to Dallas, and you can't imagine Pittsburgh just picked up Dallas and said, hey, do you want George Pickens? We'll trade him to you. He was likely shopped around. They took the best available package, and that was this third-rounder and then a swap of late-round picks, one in 2026, one in 2027, going back and forth to either side. So Dobbs probably gets you a fifth-round pick. Are you telling me for a team that its own general manager is saying in January, we're ready to compete for championships right now, are you telling me that message is being sent loud and clear if you trade away one of your most reliable targets in the passing game right now for a fifth-rounder in 2026? Like, to me, the juice is not worth the squeeze. It is just not. And then you have to factor in how things currently are taking shape. And I've mentioned it in past videos. There's genuine quantity right now and quality in that Packers wide receiver room. Up and down, Dontavian Wicks, Jaden Reed, Romeo Doubs, all good wide receivers. Then you go out and you draft Matthew Golden, you draft Savion Williams, you still have Bo Melton, you still have Malik Heath, Christian Watson, who will be coming back from injury at some point, probably in the second half of the season. But when you factor in that Watson's going to be out for a significant portion of the year, and then the idea of trading Romeo Doubs, all of a sudden, you're looking around that room and you're like, Jaden Reed, we need a lot more from you. Dontavian Wicks, we need a lot more from you. Matthew Golden, your plate's going to be more full, which is going to excite and energize Packer fans, right? You want him to get all these opportunities as a rookie. We want to see it on display. But then a guy like Savion Williams, who's a raw talent, he's going to need time to sort of mold his game together. You sort of got to wean him along a little bit. Savion Williams is not a guy that you go out there week one and you say, line him up at the X, 35 snaps. Let's see what we got in our wide receiver from the third round out of TCU. No, he's going to be used in a variety of different ways, but it's going to be, I think, a slow progression. And I do think Savion Williams will give you some real spark plays here and there as a rookie, but he could also be used as an incredible decoy at times because of the threat he possesses, but also because he's not exactly to that point where he's going to be garnering 5, 6, 7 targets on a weekly basis. But if you trade Dobbs and you already have Watson set to miss a significant portion, you're all of a sudden looking around that wide receiver room and you're like, yeah, we still have good numbers. Reed, Wicks, Golden, Williams, Melton, Heath, but we need everyone to step it up now. Because I think you could make a case that the last 2 years, I think there's a case that could be fairly easily made that the most reliable target for Jordan Love has been Romeo Doubs. And so sending that out for, again, a 2026 fifth rounder, to me it signals like, what are we doing? Now, the flip side of this, there will be some who watch this video, there will be some who have read articles, there will be some who have speculated on social media who are in the camp of just trade Romeo Doubs, he's in a contract year, blah, blah, blah. And the case being made will be, well, if Romeo Doubs plays this year out in Green Bay, doesn't get an extension, and then he walks and the Packers don't win a championship, you're letting a wide receiver who's pretty good, you're letting him walk for nothing. Not the case. You still likely get a compensatory pick for Romeo Doubs if he were in 2026 in the offseason to leave and go somewhere else away from the Green Bay Packers. And so basically it's like, do you want a fifth for 2026? But you're losing Romeo Doubs for 2025, and then you're elevating expectations for everyone else who's still left in the wide receiver room. And think about this, you can't predict injuries, right? Some guys seem to be more injury prone than others, but you're missing Watson for a large part of 2025, 2026 season. If Doubs is out of the picture, again, you have to plan this out if you're the Packers. If you're thinking about trading someone, you have to plan for, what happens in case A, case B, case C. And if you don't have Watson for a while and you trade Doubs, let's say Reed goes down with an injury in week 2 and he's set to miss 5 or 6 weeks. All of a sudden, you're looking around the wide receiver room and you're like, Wicks, you have to be our number 1 now, or Golden as a rookie. And I know he was a first-round pick, and it was the first-round pick wide receiver since 2002, but you trade Doubs knowing Watson's going to be out for a while, and either Wicks or Reed were to go down early for a chunk of time, all of a sudden there's a lot of pressure being put on that passing game, specifically the wide receiver room, because I think what you have in Tucker Kraft is incredible. I think it's a guy who's going to be a bona fide star, maybe a superstar tight end in this league. But to me, typically I don't go about things with a pros and a cons chart, but for this, if you don't want to label it as that, I was just doing the good side of this, the not so good side of this, trying to weigh it out. To me, it wasn't even close. If you don't get a deal done, an extension with Romeo Doubs, if he is playing somewhere else in 2026, you still likely get a compensatory pick for Romeo Doubs. If you trade him now, you lose all that production, you lose that reliability, you lose that safety valve in the passing game for Jordan Love. Again, I think they don't have a true number 1 right now. And you hope that either one of these guys takes it by the horns or that Matthew Golden is that piece of the puzzle at some point. Expecting him to come into this room, this offense, and be the number 1 right out of the gates, to me, those are lofty, unrealistic expectations, even though Golden was a first-round pick for Green Bay. But you want someone to take it by the reins. And Romeo Doubs, if nothing else, right? Like, he at least gives you an incredible safety valve in this passing game and in this offense. And to me, if it just everything adds up to why would you trade him? Goody says in January, we want to compete for championships now. These guys are ready. His words, not mine. Trading Doubs away would signal, hey, we still want to compete for a championship, but we want to get a little greedy and stack up some picks for the future. And in this case, again, it likely, let's say best case scenario, you're like, Doubs wouldn't go for a 5th, he'd go for a 4th. Okay, he goes for a 4th. Is the juice worth the squeeze then? To me, it's not. And him being out of the equation, you're missing a significant bite of the apple when you talk about what would be missing in this passing game with Watson again gone for quite some time. We know that. And then Doubs being traded and sent elsewhere. Just doesn't add up for a team that's trying to win now. And again, if you can't work out an extension, I get that part of it, but you likely get a compensatory pick for Doubs. I don't see how it makes sense for Green Bay to do it. If they were to trade someone, and if it is Romeo Doubs this offseason, I can't sit here and say I'd be stunned, because there's just been a lot of rumblings, a lot of speculation, and some of it's from not overly credible sources, right, on social media, but you just wonder if it's crossed their mind, if it's crossed their plate. And I do think the Packers having to suspend him for a game last year for conduct detrimental to the team, like, you just skip 2 practices and you don't notify anyone on the team and it's because you're upset with your role, not exactly a good sign, not exactly a good omen moving forward. And you have to have team personnel show up at your home or your residence just to make sure you're okay. Like, that didn't bode well. But Romeo Doubs seemed to be, everything we saw, it looked like he was welcomed back with open arms by his teammates. And guessing was apologetic to them for, how he displayed his character in that little time frame. So I get the concern if you're Green Bay, like, man, do we want to talk extension with a guy who just did this last year? And, the part of it that sucks, that's out of his control, is he had 2 concussions, and one was even while he started wearing a Guardian cap, which is supposed to help prevent concussions even more. At least that's what the data says, right? That's what the science behind the Guardian cap says. And he suffered another concussion. It was in the game against Philadelphia in the playoffs after having one earlier in the year. But all this stuff has to be factored in. But if you're talking about 2025 right now, you want to compete for a championship this year, you think you have the dogs, you think you have the pieces in place to compete for a championship. Romeo Doubs is a piece. He's a piece of the puzzle for the 2025 Green Bay Packers. He's not a piece that you give away for a middling pick in the draft or a late pick in the 2026 draft. Again, doesn't make sense to me to do that. And the ripple effect is the big part of it to me. Knowing Watson's gone for a while and then Doubs is gone. Again, all of a sudden, those numbers you talk about in the wide receiver room that we talk about, that I talk about, it just looks a lot more slim with him out of the picture. So Pickens, the trade of George Pickens really stapled it home for me. Like, don't trade Doubs. It does not make sense for 2025. And if this is his last year in Green Bay, I like Romeo Doubs. I think he's a good wide receiver. Ideally, I think he fits into a championship offense as a low-end number 2, maybe a good number 2, maybe more so a number 3 wide receiver on a depth chart. If you have an offense that's pedal to the metal, full throttle, championship level, but he's so damn reliable. He's got incredible hands. I replay that touchdown in Seattle in prime time. Was the fourth last game of the season? Back of the end zone. Love puts it in a spot where it's Doubs or incomplete, and it more so looked incomplete. It's almost like he scooped it up off the turf. Like, he's had numerous catches where you're like, holy shit, not all wide receivers in the NFL are making that catch. And again, you go back to everything Goody has said all off season, why would you give away a piece that can be a pretty big factor, in my opinion, in a passing game that's looking for a jolt to start the season based off how things ended last season? Doubs is a solution. He's not a piece to trade away. And the Pickens trade just solidified that for me. He goes for a third. Are you really gonna roll the dice because a 5th rounder in 2026 sounds so enticing that you're gonna get rid of Romeo Doubs? I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't. Even if you go into training camp, even if you go into the preseason and no extensions done with Romeo Doubs, and it seems like the writing is on the wall, like, yeah, this could be his last year in Green Bay. Well, it seems like that's the case with Rasheed Walker, Sean Ryan, potentially Kingsley Enagbari. Who knows with Christian Watson? All those guys are in contract years too. Zach Tom right now is in a contract year, although that should be solved. It just, trading Doubs doesn't make sense to me. He's too valuable to this passing game as an answer, as a solution. And what you would get back doesn't satisfy it. It doesn't scratch the itch. So we'll see what Green Bay does. Pickens goes for a third to Dallas. Now Dallas has Dak Prescott with CeeDee Lamb, a true number 1, and George Pickens. That's a good duo at wide receiver. But as for the Packers, I'd stand pat. I would not trade Romeo Doubs. Let me know what you guys think. It is Mitch. I'm on YouTube. Always appreciate all the support. We'll see you next time.